February the 12th, 1997, Beijing, China. The winter air is biting, the sky a heavy, oppressive gray. A 73-year-old man dressed in a dark, nondescript overcoat quietly steps out of a hotel elevator. He pauses for a fraction of a second, his eyes carefully scanning the exits. Beside him are two North Korean minders, men whose sole purpose is to stick to him like shadows, tracking his every breath. Outside, idling in the freezing cold, a delegation car waits to take him back to the airport, and ultimately, back to Pyongyang. He has, perhaps, 30 minutes to change the course of his existence. This is not a desperate, starving refugee fleeing in the dead of night across a frozen river. This man is an architect. His name is Hwang Jang-yop, and he is the man who built Juche, the absolute, all-encompassing state ideology printed in every single North Korean textbook, carved into monuments, and woven into the very fabric of the country's constitution. He holds one of the highest-ranking positions in the entire totalitarian state. He is the man who personally tutored Kim Jong-il, teaching the future dictator how to wield ideology as a weapon, treating political theory as sacred scripture. For 50 years, Hwang has helped construct, legitimize, and fortify the most impenetrable, airtight dictatorship on the face of the earth. And now, in a matter of minutes, he is going to quietly walk away from his minders, hail a taxi, head to the South Korean consulate, and burn it all to the ground. He knows exactly what the cost of this betrayal will be. If he succeeds, if he manages to cross the threshold of that diplomatic compound, the regime he helped design will immediately arrest his wife, his daughters, his sons, and his grandchildren. They will be punished using the exact, merciless rules that he himself helped to write and justify. Intelligence reports would later suggest that a sprawling 15-carriage train would be assembled to transport around 500 people, his family, his friends, his colleagues, his students, to the brutal forced labor camps that Hwang had spent his life legitimizing. He knew this would happen. He knew the mathematical certainty of the horror he was about to unleash upon his own bloodline. So, the ultimate question remains. What did the architect see inside his own creation that was so horrifying, so fundamentally broken, that he was willing to sacrifice his entire family to escape it? And what exactly did the regime do to them once he was gone? To understand the magnitude of this defection, we must go back to the beginning. Hwang Jang-yop was born in 1923, in a Korea that did not belong to the Koreans. The Japanese Empire had swallowed the peninsula whole. Names were forcefully rewritten into Japanese. Schools were converted into indoctrination centers for the emperor. The future of an entire people was heavily rationed, dictated by an occupying force that treated the country not as a nation, but as imperial property. If you want to truly understand why the concept of self-reliance would later become a fanatic religion in North Korea, you must start right here. You start with a young, observant boy watching his homeland being stripped of its identity. Hwang was studious, brilliant, ambitious, and quietly resentful. In 1942, seeking to understand the mechanics of power, he traveled to Tokyo. He enrolled in a prestigious program at Chuo University, diligently studying how an emperor bends a society to his will, how he manufactures absolute order. And then, the Japanese Empire lost the Second World War. The map of the world fractured. The Korean peninsula was violently sliced in half, torn apart like a piece of meat between two competing global superpowers. In the north, the Soviet Union backed a young, charismatic guerrilla fighter who possessed a unique, ruthless talent for being the last man standing in any room: Kim Il-sung. Hwang, young and filled with intellectual fervor, joined the Workers' Party in 1946 at the age of 23. The timing was magical. The party was young, the country was a blank canvas, and men who could speak the language of Marxism with academic confidence were instantly elevated. They became kings without crowns. In 1949, recognizing his brilliance, the fledgling regime sent Hwang to Moscow. Officially, he was there to study. Unofficially, he was there to master the art of ideological filtration. He was absorbing Stalinist doctrine, understanding the mechanics of absolute control, and learning how a state could write its own reality. He stayed in the Soviet Union until 1953, absorbing Marxism-Leninism the way some people absorb extreme religious fundamentalism. He returned to Pyongyang with total, unwavering conviction and married a woman named Pak Song-ok. His rise was meteoric. He became a lead philosophy lecturer, a department head, and eventually the president of the prestigious Kim Il-sung University. In North Korea, the president of the premier university is not merely an academic administrator, he is a royalty of thought. Hwang's job was not just to teach students. His job was to teach the entire state how to speak. Guns and secret police can conquer a country, but only stories, myths, and unshakable beliefs can hold it together for generations. In the 1950s, Hwang found something incredibly useful in a minor speech given by Kim Il-sung. The leader had used the word Juche, a concept celebrating Korea as the master of its own destiny, independent of Soviet or Chinese interference. It wasn't a fully formed system yet, it was just a raw sentiment. Hwang took that sentiment, a mixture of post-colonial grief, national dignity, and a fierce desire for independence, and forged it into a comprehensive, inescapable doctrine. He gave it boundaries, definitions, hierarchies, and rhythmic hypnotic phrases that would soon be plastered on red banners and chanted in schools. Political independence, economic self-sufficiency, military self-reliance. On paper, it felt clean. It felt noble. If you are a small, traumatized nation wedged between the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, Juche feels like standing on your own 2 feet for the first time in history. But there was a fatal flaw in the design of Juche, and that flaw would eventually drown the country in blood. Juche states that the people are the masters of the revolution, but it also dictates that the masses, like a body without a head, cannot interpret the world for themselves. Someone must explain it to them. Someone must embody their will. Someone must be the supreme brain. In North Korea, that someone is always one man. Hwang constructed a philosophical framework where the leader literally becomes the brain and the nation becomes the physical body. It was an elegant metaphor with horrific, nightmarish consequences. If the leader is the brain and the nation is the body, then any form of disagreement is not a political debate. It is a deadly infection. Doubt becomes treason. And if treason is a biological infection threatening the body, then collective punishment, purges, and execution are not acts of tyranny. They are necessary, life-saving medicine. Hwang was an intellectual, but intellectuals have their own unique blind spots. They often believe they are steering the ship of state, when in reality, they are merely decorating the captain's cabin. By 1972, Hwang held the title of Chairman of the Supreme People's Assembly. He was lecturing to packed, rigid auditoriums. He told his audiences that traditional laws did not matter because the true, ultimate law was the will of the leader. And somewhere in those vast auditoriums, a young man was watching him with the dark, patient eyes of a prince waiting for his throne. That young man was Kim Jong-il. They met first as professor and student, but Kim Jong-il was not just any student. He was a deeply paranoid, hyper-observant heir, taking notes as if they were loaded weapons. Hwang taught him Marx, Lenin, dialectics, and the grandiose vocabulary that functions as dark magic in Pyongyang. But with every lesson, the student narrowed the focus of the philosophy. Kim Jong-il stripped away the masses, stripped away the party, and made the ideology entirely, exclusively about the absolute divinity of the leader. Kim Il-sung was aging. The succession was looming. And in a totalitarian dynamic, succession is never just politics. It is pure, raw survival. Hwang helped construct the ideological bridge that made hereditary dictatorship possible, arguing that the leader's authority is absolute, that the revolution is passed down through blood, and that history itself flows exclusively through the Kim family line. The cage was now complete. Then, in 1994, Kim Il-sung died. The founding patriarch was gone, and the philosopher who had meticulously built the intellectual walls of the system was about to learn the brutal rule that every creator eventually learns. Once the machine works perfectly, it stops needing your permission to kill. What happens when the student inherits a cage designed for his father and decides to lock the architect inside it? Kim Jong-il was not his father. Kim Il-sung was a guerrilla-turned-patriarch, outgoing, theatrical, a man who held massive meetings and demanded love like a daily tax. Kim Jong-il, however, ruled like a man who constantly expected a knife in his back. He worked in the dead of night. He used deeply private, compartmentalized channels. He spoke through handwritten notes and terrified intermediaries. He did not ask for opinions. He tested people's fear. If Kim Il-sung was a roaring campfire, Kim Jong-il was a locked concrete room with a single blinding bulb, always on, always watching. After his escape, Hwang would describe Kim Jong-il with a phrase that sounded like a chilling clinical diagnosis: extremely egoistic. This mattered because Juche was no longer a poem or a theory. It was a loaded weapon, and a weapon in the hands of a paranoid narcissist does not misfire. It gets aimed. Under Kim Jong-il, Hwang's people-centered language was violently flipped. Juche became less about national self-reliance and more about absolute self-worship. Imagine inventing a philosophy called self-reliance, only to watch it mutate into a terrifying cult of depend on me or die. That was not a twist of fate. That was Kim Jong-il reading Hwang's manual perfectly. Then, the outside world shifted, and the floor fell out from under North Korea. The Soviet Union collapsed. The subsidies stopped. The flow of cheap oil halted. Trade evaporated. North Korea's economy, already brittle and heavily reliant on communist charity, completely shattered. The country entered a phase of catastrophic euphemisms. The state media referred to the impending famine as the arduous march. But it was not arduous. It was apocalyptic. From the mid to late 1990s, hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million, North Koreans died of agonizing starvation and hunger-related diseases. The exact numbers will never be known because dictatorships do not publish death certificates for their own failures, and mass death is easy to hide when the state controls every camera and every printing press. But Hwang Jung-yap did not need a spreadsheet. He had eyes. He traveled domestically and saw massive industrial factories standing dark and silent because the power grid had utterly collapsed. He saw agricultural fields cracking open, barren without Soviet fertilizer. In the provincial towns, he saw children whose hair had turned a pale, sickly reddish color from severe protein deficiency. He saw their small bellies swelling with edema. He watched as human bodies literally consumed their own muscle tissue just to survive one more agonizing week. Hospital corridors were filled with dying patients that no doctor could treat because the medicine had run out long before the food did. But amidst this unimaginable suffering, Huang saw something even worse, something that chilled him to his very core. He saw loyalty surviving the famine. During a tour, a starving logistics officer looked Huang in the eye and proudly stated that they could all die of hunger with no problem, as long as it was for the supreme leader. A human being had successfully reduced his own fundamental biological instinct for survival into a hollow political slogan. That was Juche working. That was Huang's grand architecture holding perfectly steady under the most extreme stress imaginable, performing exactly as he had designed it to. If you are finding this deep dive into history's darkest shadows useful and captivating, please do not forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support is absolutely vital in helping this documentary content reach more people who want to understand the hidden mechanics of our world. Let us continue. The question now was whether Huang recognized the monster he was looking at before it swallowed him whole. Kim Jong-il faced a stark choice: feed the starving masses or feed the political machine. He chose the machine. The dictator understood that economic reform was dangerous. Opening the markets meant opening the borders. Opening the borders meant opening minds. And opening minds meant the people would make comparisons. In a totalitarian state, comparisons mean the end of the regime. Huang desperately proposed changes. Pragmatic, quiet loosenings of the economy. Chinese-style market reforms. He did not suggest this because he suddenly loved capitalism, but because he could do basic arithmetic. A closed economy, plus the loss of a Soviet patron, equals mass starvation. Kim Jong-il flatly refused. Even if the dictator privately knew that reform made economic sense, he was terrified that it would crack open every buried truth. If he opened the country, the purges, the gulags, the blood, the lies, and the entire catalog of atrocities the state had committed to survive would spill out into the light. As a result, Huang lost all his leverage. His high-level meetings abruptly stopped. His phone calls went unanswered. His invitations to state events evaporated into thin air. You do not get fired in North Korea, you get erased. Huang was suddenly struck by the ultimate crushing irony of his life. The very ideology that had once made him an untouchable god among men was now being used to make him completely disposable. He had built a system where only the leader was essential. He was not the leader, he was merely a footnote with a pulse. Then came the trip. In late January 1997, Huang left Pyongyang on an overseas diplomatic visit, first to Japan and then to China. Officially, it was a lecture tour, a final mission to preach the gospel of Juche to sympathetic overseas groups. Unofficially to Huang, it felt like a trap, or a loyalty test, or both. At the departure gate, his wife Pak Song-ok came out to see him off. She gently adjusted his heavy coat against the winter chill. She smiled the way a loyal spouse must smile in a surveillance state where loyalty is the only oxygen. Huang looked at her. He could have told her his plan. He could have warned her. He did not. Because in North Korea, if you speak the truth aloud, even to your own wife, it immediately becomes evidence that will hang her. So, he said goodbye with his eyes, keeping his mouth firmly shut. He turned away and walked to the car. He knew this was the absolute last time he would ever see her face. The terrifying question echoing in his mind was no longer whether he possessed the courage to defect. The question was whether he could live with the knowledge that the state would torture and execute his wife, his children, and his grandchildren using the exact legal and philosophical justifications he had spent his life perfecting. In Tokyo, the surrealism of his existence reached its peak. Huang stood in front of an attentive audience and delivered a passionate, flawless lecture on the virtues of Juche. Picture the sheer psychological torment. The man actively plotting to flee a prison was standing on a stage, meticulously explaining to a crowd why the prison was a utopia. Every polite nod from the audience, every glance toward the exits, was part of a desperate mental calculation. He was surrounded by networks loyal to Pyongyang. He knew he was boxed in. He didn't run in Tokyo. He boarded the next flight to Beijing. On February the 12th, Huang and his trusted aide Kim Dukong peeled away from the rest of the North Korean delegation under the incredibly boring pretext of going on a short shopping trip. Boring is safe. They hailed a taxi. Somewhere in the back seat of that car, driving through the sprawling streets of the Chinese capital, the great philosopher ran the final, brutal calculation of his life. He wasn't calculating whether he would get caught. He was calculating exactly who would die if he didn't. By late morning, the taxi pulled up to the South Korean consular section. There was no cinematic leap over a barbed wire wall, no violent shootout, no dramatic chase across rooftops. Just a quiet man opening a door and walking inside. He sat down at a desk and began to handwrite his statement of defection. It opened with a line that read like a fusion of a tragic confession and a dark warning. He wrote that he knew people would judge him mad for abandoning his family and his elite life, and that sometimes, sitting in that room, he felt completely mad himself. If you have ever wondered what the highest level defection in history looks like, it looks like an old man with perfect posture staring at a blank piece of paper, because paper is the only thing in the entire room that isn't armed with a gun. Then, the geopolitical standoff exploded. North Korea instantly declared it a kidnapping orchestrated by Southern spies. China, caught entirely off guard, immediately sealed the diplomatic compound with a heavy security cordon that grew tighter and more heavily armed by the hour. Paramilitary police ringed the building. Frantic diplomatic cables flew at light speed between Beijing, Seoul, and Pyongyang. South Korea raised its military alert to near-war levels. Furious North Korean operatives physically tried to force their way through the consulate gates as the realization dawned on them: the architect of their entire reality was sitting just behind those brick walls. Hwang was now trapped on a tiny, microscopic piece of South Korean soil, deep inside Chinese territory, surrounded by thousands of Chinese guns, with North Korean fury building like catastrophic pressure inside a sealed boiler. Three powerful governments were threatening war over one old man, and none of them could afford the humiliation of blinking first. For 34 agonizing days, Hwang stayed inside that compound. He slept poorly under the harsh hum of fluorescent office lights. He ate whatever the terrified diplomats could scavenge. He listened intently to every set of footsteps echoing in the hallway, because footsteps meant decisions and decisions meant life or death. The man who had once written the master script for national obedience was now utterly helpless, waiting for foreign governments to decide his fate. North Korea threatened countermeasures. In Pyongyang's vocabulary, that word could mean artillery strikes across the border. It could mean commando raids. Or it could mean an assassin's bullet delivered years later in a dark alley in a foreign city. Kim Jong-il eventually broadcasted a chilling coded message over state radio: cowards should leave if they want to. To the outside world, it sounded dismissive. To Hwang, it was a death sentence. It meant his life was officially forfeit. And to every other elite official watching nervously in Pyongyang, it was a terrifying warning: do not even think about trying this. China, desperate for a resolution that didn't humiliate its unpredictable North Korean ally, engineered a diplomatic detour. Hwang was not allowed to fly straight to Seoul. Instead, he was quietly routed to the Philippines, where he was kept in a holding pattern for another 33 days. Finally, in April of 1997, 67 days after he stepped through that consulate door, Hwang boarded a flight to South Korea. As the plane approached the peninsula, heavily armed fighter jets scrambled to escort him through the airspace, treating him as though he were a visiting head of state. And in a very dark, very real sense, he was. He was carrying in his mind the closest thing to a user manual for the North Korean regime that the outside world had ever possessed. But how exactly does a totalitarian dictatorship punish a traitor it can no longer physically reach? And what happens when the horrific severity of that punishment proves that the traitor was absolutely right to flee in the first place? North Korea punishes betrayal the exact same way it punishes a highly infectious disease: by burning the entire village to the ground. The state doctrine is guilt by association, ruthlessly enforced across up to 3 generations. Grandparents, parents, children, toddlers, neighbors, and even colleagues who merely shared a hallway. Anyone whose shadow overlapped with the accused is erased. The logic is mechanical and relentless, leaving absolutely zero space for innocence or mercy. Hwang knew this better than anyone, because he had provided the philosophical framework that allowed the state to call such unspeakable cruelty a necessary defense of the revolution. Now, sitting safely in Seoul, he was forced to watch as the infernal machine applied those exact rules to his own name. Within months, horrifying accounts emerged of mass arrests tied directly to his defection. One intelligence report placed the number of arrested associates and family members at around 500 people. One specific detail sticks in the mind like a rusted splinter. The state assembled a massive freight train, 15 carriages long, solely to transport his bloodline and his social circle into oblivion. Somewhere on that dark, freezing train, a confused child begging his grandfather for a piece of candy was loaded aboard, condemned to a lifetime of starvation and slave labor because of the actions of an uncle he barely knew. Human rights investigations later cited eyewitness testimonies stating that Hwang's entire family was swallowed into the hidden, nightmare geography of the political prison camps, the management centers where human names are permanently erased and replaced by numbers. It was not a cinematic act of revenge. It was sheer bureaucratic horror. A typed list, a knock on the door at midnight, a covered truck, a freezing station platform. Every step was methodical, procedural, and chillingly calm. Reports later confirmed that his wife, Pak Song-ok, died shortly after his escape by suicide. One of his daughters died under incredibly murky, violent circumstances. Different intelligence sources disagree on the exact methods of their deaths. That is exactly what the regime does. It murders people in the dark, and then it systematically murders the clarity of the truth. In Seoul, Hwang fully expected to become a powerful active weapon against Pyongyang. Instead, he became a protected museum exhibit. He lived under constant suffocating armed guard in a government-provided safe house. South Korean intelligence relentlessly debriefed him, extracting every ounce of his knowledge. He knew how decisions were made in the inner sanctums. He knew how the illusion of loyalty was manufactured. But South Korea had a political problem. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the government in Seoul was deeply invested in the Sunshine Policy, a strategy of engagement, aid, and summits driven by the optimistic belief that you could soften a brutal regime by hugging it long enough. Hwang Jang-yeop was not a hug. He was a blaring air raid siren. His very existence complicated delicate diplomacy. His dire warnings offended politicians who needed optimism to sell their policies to the public. He criticized. He pushed. He flatly refused to perform the cheerful, diplomatic script of "let us not upset Pyongyang." As a result, he was sidelined. His travel was heavily restricted under the guise of safety. He was quietly removed from key research positions. The man who had risked everything to escape a dictatorship immediately ran headfirst into a democracy's preference for political convenience. And then, the assassins came. In 2010, South Korean prosecutors made a chilling announcement. Two elite North Korean army majors had successfully infiltrated the country, perfectly posing as desperate defectors. They had trained for years for one single defining mission. They had traveled through the perilous underground railroad in Thailand, entered the South Korean resettlement pipeline alongside genuine traumatized refugees, and waited. Their explicit orders were to monitor Hwang, get close to his security detail, and slit his throat. The regime had sent highly trained killers, cleverly disguised as victims, into the very humanitarian pipeline built to save victims. They weaponized the empathy of a democracy. Hwang's reaction to the assassination plot was not panic. It was a cold, dark resignation. He famously stated that there was absolutely no difference between dying naturally of old age or being killed by Kim Jong-il's assassins, because, to him, his own death was no longer the crisis. The true crisis was the horrifying realization that his creation was still alive, still hungry, and still actively hunting for his throat across international borders. If a philosophical prison can hunt its own architect across the world, and if even a vibrant democracy cannot fully set him free from the fear, what chance does a starving citizen inside the prison ever have? Despite the constant threat of death, Hwang kept working. He wrote more than a dozen books, essays, and lectures. He founded a think tank filled with other high-level defectors, trying to turn his philosophical knowledge into blunt force. He spent his final years trying to forge words sharp enough to cut through the titanium propaganda that he himself had helped to harden. He also discovered a new, profound kind of loneliness. In North Korea, millions of people pretended to agree with him because agreeing with Hwang Jang-yeop was a matter of survival. In South Korea, people had the freedom to disagree with him openly. And they did. Some hailed him as a legendary hero who risked everything for the truth. Others viewed him as deeply compromised, a man who had comfortably profited from mass tyranny for 50 years before his conscience finally decided to twitch. He faced the ultimate paradox of a free society. Speech is abundant, but genuine trust is incredibly scarce. And for anyone following this story, you are forced into an uncomfortable morally gray seat. How much sympathy does the chief architect of a totalitarian nightmare truly deserve when he finally decides he wants out? There is no clean, easy answer. On October the 10th, 2010, Hwang Jang-yeop was found dead in the bathtub of his heavily guarded Seoul safe house. Police ruled it natural heart failure. There was no poison found. There was no forced entry by assassins. There was no cinematic bloody showdown. It was just the banal, quiet ending of an exhausted 87-year-old body. And on that exact same day, because history possesses a deeply cruel and ironic sense of rhythm, North Korea staged a massive, earth-shaking military parade in Pyongyang to celebrate the anniversary of the Workers' Party. Kim Jong-il stood triumphantly on the viewing balcony, and standing right beside him, being formally introduced to the world, was a young, heavy-set man named Kim Jong-un. The dynasty continued. The ideology continued. Juche still sits at the absolute center of North Korea's constitution as the unshakable guiding principle of the state. Hwang Jang-yeop successfully escaped the country, but the country did not escape what he built. He spent the first half of his life meticulously constructing a psychological cage so complete, so structurally perfect, that it could run itself without him. He spent the second half of his life watching in horror as it did exactly that. The monster does not die just because its creator walks away. It simply eats in his absence. It continues to teach starving children to recite the exact scripts he helped write. It flattens all human doubt into a terrifying silence. Somewhere in Pyongyang right now, a prison guard does not need to do anything brave or heroic to maintain the terror. He only needs to turn the page in a textbook. Because the ultimate cage is not made of iron bars or concrete walls. It is made of belief. Hwang walked out into the light, but his blueprint stayed behind in the dark. 25 million human beings still live, breathe, and die inside it.